Hi, kids. I had mentioned to your parents about doing something like bedtime stories just for a while and see how that goes. And guess what I get to do? Somebody loaned me their copy of Frog. Oops, where is it? There it is. Frog and Toad. Okay, one of my favorites to play or to read through. And so I'm going to read the first two stories tonight, and then your moms and dads can show you this um, when it's time. Okay, so here's spring. I don't know if you can see it. There we go. Frog ran up the path to Toad's house. He knocked on the front door. There was no answer. Toad, Toad, shouted Frog. Wake up! It is spring. Bah, said a voice from inside the house. Toad, Toad, cried Frog. The sun is shining. Do you see Frog? Do you see him at the front door? The sun is shining. The snow is melting. Wake up. I'm not here, said the voice. Frog walked into the house. It was dark. All the shutters were closed. Toad, where are you? Called Frog. Go away, said the voice. From a corner of the room, Toad was lying in bed. Do you see Toad? Look at him. Do you look like that when you go to bed and wake up in the morning? He had pulled all the covers over his head. Frog pushed Toad out of bed. He pushed him out of the house and onto the front porch. I don't know, would you like somebody pushing you out of bed and pushing you onto the front porch early in the morning? He pushed him out of the house and onto the front porch. Toad blinked in the bright sun. Help, said Toad. I cannot see anything. Don't be silly, said Frog. What you see is the clear, warm light of April, and it means that we can begin a whole new year together, Toad. Think of it, said Frog. We will skip through the meadows and run through the woods and swim in the river, and in the evenings we will sit right here on this front porch and count the stars. You count them then, Frog, said Toad. I will be too tired. I'm going back to bed. Do you feel like Toad sometimes? Toad went back into the house. He got into bed and pulled the covers over his head again. But Toad, cried Frog, you will miss all the fun. Listen, Frog, said Toad. How long have I been asleep? You've been asleep since November, said Frog. Well then, said Toad, a little more sleep will not hurt me. Come back again and wake me up in 1/2 May. Good night, Frog. There he goes. Look at him under the sheets. But Toad, said Frog, I will be lonely until then. Toad did not answer. He had fallen asleep. Frog looked up at Toad's calendar. The November page was still on top. Frog tore off the November page. He tore off the December page, and the January page, and the February page, and the March page. He came to the April page. Frog tore off the April page too. Good old Frog. Then Frog ran back to Toad's bed. Toad, Toad, wake up. It is May now. What? Said Toad. Can it be May so soon? Yes, said Frog. Look at your calendar. See, look, he's got his calendar. See it right there? He's showing the calendar. It says May. Toad looked at the calendar, and the May page was on top. Why, it is Toad, and as he climbed out of bed. Then he and Frog ran outside to see how the world was looking in the spring. I love Frog and Toad. Do you like Frog and Toad stories? I hope so. Now, the story. One day in summer, Frog was not feeling well. Toad said, Frog, you're looking quite green. That's kind of funny, seeing as how frogs are normally green. But I always look green, said Frog. I am a frog. Today you look very green, even for a frog, said Toad. Get into my bed and rest. Toad made Frog a cup of hot tea. What a good friend. Frog drank the tea, and then he said, Tell me a story while I am resting. Do you see them in bed? Do you see him in bed there? And see the tea? He's getting him tea. Here's Toad trying to figure out a story. All right, said Toad. Let me think of a story to tell you. Toad fought and fought, but he could not think of a story to tell Frog. I will go out on the front porch and walk up and down, said Toad. Perhaps that will help me to think of a story. Toad walked up and down on the porch for a long time, but he could not think of a story to tell Frog. Look at him. See him walking on the porch? Then Toad went into the house and stood on his head. Stood on his head? Stood on his head? Stood on his head. Why are you standing on your head? Said Frog. I hope that if I stand on my head, it will help me to think of a story, said Toad. There he is. See him standing on his head? Toad stood on his head for a long time, but he could not think of a story to tell Frog. Then Toad poured a glass of water over his head. Why are you pouring water over your head? Asked Frog. I hope that if I pour water over my head, it will help me to think of a story, said Toad. Toad poured many glasses of water over his head, but he could not think of a story to tell Frog. Look at him pouring water on his head. How silly. Then Toad began to bang his head against the wall. Boom, boom, boom. Why are you banging your head against the wall? Asked Frog. I hope that if I bang my head against the wall hard enough, it will help me to think of a story, said Toad. There he is, kind of dizzy. Would you be dizzy if you banged your head against the wall? I know I would. I'm feeling much better now, Toad, said Frog. I do not think I need a story anymore. Then you get out of bed and let me get into it, said Toad, because now I feel terrible. Frog said, Would you like me to tell you a story, Toad? Yes, said Toad, if you know one. Look at him. There's Frog getting out, and there's Toad with his head. You see that? Poor guy. Once upon a time, excuse me. Once upon a time, said Frog, there were two good friends, a frog and a toad. The frog was not feeling well. He asked his friend the toad to tell him a story. The toad could not think of a story. He walked up and down on the porch, but he could not think of a story. He stood on his head, but he could not think of a story. He poured water over his head, but could not think of a story. He banged his head against the wall, but still he could not think of a story. Then the toad did not feel so well, and the frog was feeling better. So the toad went to bed, and the frog got up and told him a story. The end. How was that, Toad? Said Frog. But Toad did not answer. He had fallen asleep. What a great story. And there we go. 2 stories for tonight. I'll pick them up tomorrow night and do the next 2 stories. I hope you sleep well tonight. Bye-bye now.